We have other actors that are upstream. Well, they still have a great business in seeds and pesticides and fertilizer. They know that this system has an expiration date. And that expiration date is our society's permission to operate.
Welcome to The Adjacent Possible, the podcast where we journey into the frontiers of our unfolding future. The Adjacent Possible is a kind of shadow future, hovering at the edges of the present. You could think of it sort of as a map, in all of the ways in which the world could reinvent itself. Here we step into that map, and I'm your host, Lisa. Today I'm joined by Ivo Degn, a leading voice in the regenerative agriculture movement, a systems thinker, farmer ally, and co-founder of Climate Farmers. Ivo is working to transform Europe's agri-food system and place farmers at the very heart of the transition. In this conversation, we explore something profoundly hopeful. What if we optimized not for yield, not even for sustainability, but for life itself? We also dive into the hidden conflicts shaping our food systems today, the paradigm shifts already underway, and what a regenerative future could look like. Let's step into the adjacent possible. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
We've known each other for a few years. I have been following your work from primarily LinkedIn. You're very active on LinkedIn and you're very much a dominant voice in regenerative agriculture. Tell us a little bit how you got into this. Why regenerative agriculture?
Well, there's several answers to this. One is the pragmatic and technical one, and it's okay, there's potential there and we can do a lot with it. There's the personal one that I'm also only starting to uncover over the years, and I'm starting to understand more and more. And maybe to start with that, my mother was one of the pioneers of non-violent animal training in Europe. It's something that has shaped me a lot. It's something that was formative in my childhood. Key to that idea was that animals are not something that we use, are not something that we play with or something like that. They are teachers to us as humans. And that was a belief that she held and that she represented very strongly. And I've grown up in this. I did not see another reality for a very long time. I grew up in a rural space, on a farm, quite secluded in the middle of a forest. So my reality was a lot that animals and living systems are teachers to us. When I was 6, I started going to school and realized, like, wait a second, there's a different reality over there, right? And so it was always clear that there's that one reality that I had gotten to know, that I know works, that I know like there is a way of treating animals and treating living systems in a way that is very relational, and not even that we are stewards of it, that we are really learners at one part of the larger system. And then I saw that there's another world that thinks about this completely differently, and I was always a bit confused by that. And as a young adult, I would interact, of course, way more with the world that was not the one that I grew up in, and sort of oriented myself in that universe. I think what regenerative agriculture is for me is the combination of both worlds. What we have in regenerative agriculture is the practice of what I experienced as a child. Farmers, stewards, people working with land, realizing that they can be learners from the larger ecosystem, and seeing how that has incredible payoffs that lead to higher profitability, higher resilience, higher quality of the produce, etc. But mostly it's also a lifestyle choice. This is just how they prefer to be. And I have watched regenerative agriculture for a long time, way before I worked in it, just because I grew up in agriculture and it's something I always found interesting. But it was always small. It was always like that niche, nice thing, but it wasn't really something that felt like it would interact with that other world that I had gotten to know. And then at some point I found research in 2017, 2018, 2019 around the carbon potential in regenerative agriculture. I saw that there was the conversation that the permaculturalist or that the regenerative agriculture had about building healthy soil, building topsoil. And there was the research language around carbon sequestration through agricultural soils. I was like, I wonder whether they mean the same thing, whether building healthy soils means building carbon-rich soils. And it turns out, yes, they did. Of course, this has already been researched for a very long time, but in 2017 to 2020, let's say, this sort of was rediscovered. It was conventionally believed that building a centimeter of topsoil takes about 100 years. We're losing topsoil way faster than that. So the belief was this is a finite resource. Since it would take 100 years to build a centimeter and we're losing it at a much faster rate, it seemed like at some point we would simply run out of soil and there's nothing we can do about it. And so relatively recently, like in less than 10 years ago, we came to the conclusion like, wait a second, we could actually do this way faster. Of course, farmers have known this for a long time and they've practiced this, but research came to that conclusion. And it took a bit of digging to put those pieces together for me and say, no, it does seem like there's actually a connection between what some people that were way out there, were a bit esoteric, not very mainstream, talked about in terms of topsoil building and permacultural practices, and what very serious researchers were saying about, hey, wait a second, we could potentially have a significant or make a significant dent in emissions. That means we suddenly have a systemic lever for change. We're not talking about a potential, like a small niche thing. We're talking about something that actually should be very interesting for the very large mainstream.
I mean, all that sounds beautiful, right? There is this really clear systemic lever for change, the carbon capture that this world sorely needs solutions for. So this is something that has been a bit fringe, at least when you grew up. What is the situation today?
It's changed fundamentally in the fastest amount of time. My very ambitious theory in 2018, 2019, where I was thinking, okay, let's do something about this. Like I looked at the system analysis and looked at, okay, where do we have different dynamics in the agri-food sector? Where is it right now? What are sort of different forces that influence it, the directions it's taking, what are trends? And pretty much everything that affects agriculture points to regenerative agriculture becoming a significant thing, which was crazy because in 2018 nobody knew about this. Very few people talked about this at all.
Who were the people who were practicing regenerative agriculture in 2018? Was it in the language of policymakers at that time?
Right, not at all. Not in policy, not in industry. And it's good that you asked this because this has been practiced since forever, right? This is very important to say. This is nothing new. This is something that has been practiced by people taking care of land or stewarding land or cultivating land since forever. So it's very important to point out that this has been indigenous practice for forever, and that also farmers of all creeds have been practicing this since forever. They didn't call it that. They might have used a different term. For example, organic agriculture started with exactly that same vision, and a lot of organic farmers have always done this. So we have a lot of what could possibly be described as indigenous agricultural practices in Europe. It has been done for a long time, but it wasn't mainstream. There's a story that I often tell. In 2019, I was at a conference here in Barcelona, and at the end of one day, I was in a restaurant with a couple of Nestlé executives, and they asked me what I was doing. I told them about this idea I had about regenerative agriculture. They listened attentively and asked questions, and they started laughing. I said, "This is really cute, but it's never going to happen. Like, let's be serious. It's a really nice idea.
Scale,
it's never exactly. It's a nice idea. It's something that's going to happen, but like not big. Let's be serious about this." 2 years later, I think it was 2021, Nestlé surprised definitely me, I think most people, with a commitment of 50% of their supply chain to be sourced from regenerative agriculture by, I believe, 2035. So they went from, just talking about the speed of the change, we went from 2019, their executives have never heard of it and thought it was laughable, to their top leadership saying we're going to convert 50% of our supply chain of the world's largest food producer to regenerative agriculture. So this went extremely fast.
What, in your perspective, happened there in those years that made this accelerate?
I'm still trying to puzzle it together. I've been talking to a lot of people that were involved in these processes. To be honest, I'm not 100% clear about it, how that quick shift happened and what motivated it. Regenerative agriculture could be looked on from the sustainability, from the marketing, or from the procurement aspect if we're talking about food industry. It's a good story, and you could say it's a good greenwashing story because it sounds very similar to organic, right? It sounds very similar to sustainable. It almost sounds a bit better. But there isn't any certification and no pesky NGOs that are going to ask you to certify it.
You have no standards holding you accountable to your claims.
Not at that point.
And is that a problem for regenerative agriculture?
You could say so, yes. I think it's something it's a longer and complex story we can get into, but it is a risk, let's say, that it has been picked up by large corporations very quickly before the space was actually ready. While this is growing very fast, what we do is to build the infrastructure under it so it doesn't dissolve in greenwashing and meaninglessness. This is practically our mission statement.
So if we wanted to circle around the dominant conflict in farming today, you have on the one side industrial agriculture, which is the status quo, and then you have regenerative. What is the dominant conflict or tension between the two?
Yeah, this needs us to take a few steps back because we often talk about the current mainstream agriculture as traditional agriculture, and that's a misnomer. The current way, conventional industrial agriculture, originates after the Second World War in Europe, where the sense was we need to produce a lot of food after the war to feed the whole world. And there was worry about famine, especially in India and Mexico at that time. And in the war, there had been a lot of research done about industrial methods using chemistry, also new findings about how to use chemistry, unfortunately, for very terrible means, or very terrible ends and means. And so we came out of the war with a famine problem, with new research, and we found that we could apply these findings to improving yield of main crops, like of corn, wheat, etc. This was the Haber-Bosch process of producing nitrogen from fossil fuel. It was the introduction of pesticides, basically using a lot of the chemicals that were developed during the war that we had left over after the war for the eradication of certain agricultural pests. And it seemed like we would be able to produce way more food in this way. And so this is what started was called the Green Revolution. And in a very short amount of time, we significantly changed agricultural practices around the world. As a farmer, you would produce for your family, you would sell to your community, and sort of a bit, right? But mainly it was regional to a commodity system where we would produce the same 3, 4, 5 crops primarily throughout the entire world, all in the same way in a plug-and-play solution, specific seeds, specific fertilizers, specific pesticides, and we boosted production. We grew way more food on less hectares. We probably avoided significant famines in India and Mexico. There's different opinions on it, but we could say this probably saved millions. The negative side of it is that even though it boosted productivity for a few years, those results subsided as it exhausted the soils. So in order to continue producing at a similar level, they had to add better new seeds. They had to add more pesticides, more fertilizers. And so it became a vicious circle. But a lot of the systems had already changed at that point. So a lot of farmers had already invested in the infrastructure, had already bought new tractors, new machinery, increased the size of their farm, etc. So in order to pay off all of that, in order to make use of the new markets, they had to continue using this, even though profit-wise it didn't make sense anymore. And there's a key point here around metrics. We changed at that point the core metric a farmer should look at from profit. As a business, you run a business, you run a family business, you need to make money, not become rich from it, but make money, to yield. And so even today still farmers are taught to maximize yield. They produce a lot. The theory was if you produce a lot, you can sell a lot, so you make a lot of money. Well, what turns out is they produce a lot, but they have to buy a lot in order to produce a lot. So at the beginning of the season, you buy seeds, you buy fertilizer, you buy pesticides, you buy diesel, you buy machinery, right? And then you also still have your loans from the infrastructure that you have built, right? Then you produce. And then hopefully you produce a lot. So then you get a similar output, and so it sort of works out. Problem is, we're now in a time where the soils are exhausted and we have climate change. So more and more, that peak productivity we're talking about doesn't turn out anymore. And so the farmers do not get the yield that they had expected. Plus, of course, when everybody produces a lot, so the prices go down. So it turns out now we have a system that requires a ton of inputs to produce quite high outputs, but the farmers are not actually making money anymore. So they should look at profitability, which would mean maybe, okay, it's okay to produce less as long as you have less inputs, right? So you still might make more money. So there's the history of this is that we said maximize productivity as much as you can, and we need to feed the world. That's the story we get. So when you ask about the main conflict, whenever the last years, this has stopped, but the last years, whenever I would be on any stage, in any panel discussion, any presentation, the first question would always be, yeah, this is really nice, but how are you going to feed the world with this? And it's a very simple to answer. A, how are you going to feed the world with this? Because with the system we have right now, it's clearly not sustainable in any way, ecologically, economically, socially. And B, by now we have the data that regenerative agriculture can be more productive than industrial agriculture, even while improving the soil, even while improving the water, even while improving the biodiversity, profitability, the farm satisfaction, mental health of farmers, community health. So the conflict so far has always been between maximum productivity and what would be called sustainable intensification. So if the idea is we produce a lot on few hectares and the rest of the hectares we can give back to nature. It has never happened this way, but that's the theory. On the other hand, conservation efforts, we say we produce less and we need to enhance biodiversity, and we take into account that we're going to produce less in exchange for it. That's the organic idea. That's what is the environmental NGOs propagate. What we have with regenerative is a way to do both. And that is the unique, this is what is new right now, is the possibility to actually say, well, we can produce as much while improving the biodiversity, the economic, the social health of our farm systems.
It sounds to me like the core of this conflict is, what do you plan to optimize for? The people who are upholding this status quo with industrial farming, do you find them to be easy to cooperate with, or do you find that they're fighting to stick to this paradigm? Like, what do they have to lose in switching over to regenerative agriculture?
That question led us to this mapping exercise that we've been doing the last couple of years to understand the dynamics in this space and who is trying to do what and how, and where do we have conflicts of interest that are blocking us. We're talking about one of the largest systems in our society. Everything depends on agriculture, right? So there is a lot of delay in that system. So if we decided something in the 1950s, 1960s, we are now seeing the results of this. So if we now take a decision, we're not going to see the result tomorrow. We're going to see a lot of these results quite a bit down the road. So there are some actors in the system that might be actively still propagating that system of the past. There are some that are propagating it because they are locked into it. The example from the farmer side is it's not working for them. The farmers are upset in a lot of different ways. The system as it is not really working for them, but they're locked into it. And the reason, and this is really important to say, the reason they're locked into it is because we locked them into it. So we have educated farmers into it, we have incentivized them into it, we have regulated them into it. We asked farmers to do exactly what they're doing today, and they have done it. We as a society have asked them to create intensive livestock production. We have given them better loans, we have given them subsidies, we have made them do this. If we're criticizing farmers, we should be criticizing ourselves. So they might be pushing for a continuation of this because we are not relieving their debt from the old system. So these are actors that are not necessarily convinced of it, but they have to continue. We have other actors that earn money from the current system. Traditionally, this was the larger food industry, which is everything from what is called upstream, so pesticides, fertilizer, seeds. Then we have everything that is downstream, so all the processing, the trading, the retailing of the product. And they used to work together quite a lot in policy influencing because they all benefit from a cheap commodity products. We now see a new split that's happening there, which is really interesting because large processing, trading, retailing companies are seeing the effect of climate change. Just one of the biggest and most important crops in the world, cocoa or coffee, is really, really heavily affected by climate change. So just this week, we saw huge price spikes in cocoa and chocolate. So if you want to eat chocolate, buy chocolate now because it's going to be expensive probably for the future. So if you're Nestlé and your business is primarily chocolate and coffee, and you see climate change happening at that rate, you know that you have to invest in something that can actually buffer climate change. So you see those companies leaving that sort of unholy alliance, so to say, and starting to advocate for a new system, which is the shift that we just talked about. So this is not the marketing department, this is now the procurement department, which has way more power in such a corporate. We have other actors that are upstream, where they still have a great business in seeds and pesticides and fertilizer. They know that this system has an expiration date. And that expiration date is our society's permission to operate. At a certain point, we as a society, we say we don't want that amount of nitrogen runoff in our groundwaters anymore. We don't want pesticides anymore. And they know that will come. They are fully aware of it. The question is, when does that come, in 5 years or in 50 years or in 100 years? And there's a lot of billions to be made in the difference between 5 to 50 years. So those actors talk about regenerative agriculture. They are also acting on it. They also all have regenerative agriculture programs by now, and they're not all bad. They're some of the most interesting ones, actually, I would say. But they do not stand to make as much money from regenerative agriculture as from the current system. So for them, it's putting the toes in the water, but they're not going to put weight on this until they have to.
So on the one hand, we have the upstream actors that you say they're going to try to just maximize their profits as long as we give them permission to do so, collectively as a society. And then you have companies like Nestlé who see that when this issue becomes material for them, when it impacts their bottom line, they're going to get moving and they're going to do things differently. Are they open to dialogue about this with actors like your organization?
Absolutely. They are not direct partners of ours, I would not say that. Our role in the system is what we call backbone organizers. We are trying to sort of be in the background of this and see where do we have these systemic dynamics, where we have intervention points, and who have to work together in order to make a difference. And so we talk with everyone and we try to understand the interests of each actor in order to see, okay, how could they be helped to support the larger system in a specific direction. So we are talking with all the large food corporations, and they have that interest and they understand it. They understand the economics of it, they understand the agronomy of it. And this is so interesting because when you go to that level of detail and that level of empathy, you stop demonizing, okay, why are these people not doing it even though they could? Case in point, Nestlé does not own the supply chain. They don't have supply chain transparency. They don't know. If you ask them where does the grain come from in that granola bar, they simply do not know. They know that they buy from a trader in a specific region. They might know the mill that they buy the flour from or the grain from, but they will not know the individual farmer. So if they want to implement a regenerative agriculture program, they actually have the problem that they don't know the farmer. So they know the region. So what they can do is they can implement a regenerative agriculture program in that general region, but they cannot target the specific farmers because of the way their specific supply chain is set up. Other companies know their supply chain all the way. And so the problem that they have now is the grain mill, which means there is many tons of grain that goes into this grain mill, and then flour comes out of it. So you don't buy regenerative flour, you buy flour, and some amount of the grain that has gone in there was maybe from a regenerative farm or maybe wasn't, but it's untraceable.
Which of course then takes away the incentive for the farmer to adopt regenerative practices, because if you're just going to put your grains into the same mill where it just goes out as one homogeneous product.
Exactly.
Where is the...
And for both of them, right? Both the farmer and the corporate loses the story. If I go to the farmer's market, I have story value in those carrots, right? I buy story value, I pay story value. I might pay 3 times, 5 times as much for that story value. That grain loses story value the moment it goes into that mill. And so also the corporate loses story value. So how are they going to tell that story? The problem is, now again, sort of the delay in the system, we have killed all the small mills in Europe and optimized for efficiency. We have a few very large mills. The extreme example of this, in the US you have 3 beef processing facilities, abattoirs, butcheries, very large ones, that process 85% of all beef in the US. Almost all of the beef in the US goes through 3 facilities. Millions of the animals that go in there and beef that comes out of it. But there is no traceability. Everything goes in and it goes through a big meat grinder and comes out the other end, right? And now imagine you have a region and farmers produce regeneratively in that region, and then they have a small abattoir that process their couple of hundred, and then they bring that to consumers and they bring that to restaurants, and you can say that steak came from that farm and it ate this and it has that health benefit. You can tell that story, but you cannot tell that if we don't have the infrastructure for it. And to build infrastructure takes a very long time.
When you talk about infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure are you referring to?
So as consumers, we often think of it as, okay, I buy directly from farmers, but you buy directly from the farmer, you buy the tomato, the paprika, the eggs, even maybe the meat. But this is a single product, right? So that farmer might produce eggs and they can sell you the eggs. Now try and buy a pancake mix. So you need 3 different farmers, right? Because the farmer that has the eggs doesn't have the milk, doesn't have the grain. So you need somebody who processes that pancake mix. The problem is once we have any kind of processed product, which a lot of the stuff that we eat is, we need processing infrastructure in between. This is just one example of a blocker we currently have in the system, that even if a large corporation would want to seriously take action, they would run against that kind of barrier. And then they would say, okay, well, we don't fully know our regenerative produce, and we don't fully know if now we're more resilient, and if now we have less carbon, and if now we have better value. There's ways around this, it's called mass equivalent, but it is one of the blockers that we have.
So we talked about the surface layer of the problem and the structure underpinning that problem. If we were to just turn towards regenerative agriculture, what type of demand would we need to create to enable this system taking root?
I think we have to say that the role of the consumer is overestimated. We tend to think of ourselves as consumers as being relevant. It turns out we're not. And that's a bit of an oversimplification, but the story often goes that what consumers want is what the shops will provide. And it's the other way around, in fact. It's not that what we buy is what the supermarkets put on the shelves. It is what the shelves provide that we buy. And that changes our habits of buying. When it comes to participating in the commodity system, buying at the supermarket, for example, I would say, of course, send signals, etc. And one of the arguments that the retailers will always bring is to say, consumers always say they want more sustainable, but then they don't actually buy, so we can't do more of this. Whatever, always good, buy the more expensive and certified product, 100%. Much more important, buy from your producer directly. And that does not mean buy local, and this is important. Buy local in terms of is often said as a climate solution. In terms of emissions, it's almost irrelevant. It does not really matter. Like if you've held back from buying pineapple from somewhere, organic, fair trade, etc., you don't have to. It does not make a significant difference in terms of CO2. What does make a difference is to buy without the middle people. You don't want to buy from a supermarket because that product has gone through 15 different middlemen and women and probably institutions. It has increased a lot in price and there's very little that arrives with the farmer. Go to a platform, and by now they exist on almost everything. Meat, eggs, even milk if it comes to vegetables. Even grains, you can buy those directly from farmers or farmer cooperatives. Then more money will stay with these people and you're investing in those infrastructures. Crowd farming is a great example. In meat, it depends on your region. In France, you now have a platform called OMI, OMIE, and they sell regenerative produce directly. You can buy from a lot of farms directly. That really makes a difference. Buying local from the supermarket does not. And if you can, avoid going to the supermarket. It is not helpful.
That's a very clear tip. I always want to ask everyone who comes here to talk about their solutions to give one actionable direction to people who listen and who want to contribute to this solution becoming a reality. Do you have any other actionable directions that you would want to give listeners?
I think a related one is spend a significant amount of your income on food. We have, over the last couple of decades, reduced the percentage of the money that we spend in total on food. That's not helpful. If you want to buy good quality food, spend money on it. People need to live. Don't give it to supermarkets, give it to farmers. And connected to that, go and visit farms. Because these stories we hear, they are mixed up in every direction. You hear on the one hand about how terrible farming is and how cruel and how terrible chemicals, etc., etc. On the other hand, we hear about farming as that romanticized image of the small farm and super diversified. It's not like that either. Go to the farm and visit. There are a lot of farms that are very willing to receive visitors. They offer tours, etc. So find in your local region. It could be called community supported agriculture. It could be a market garden. There's a platform that has recently launched called the Top 50 Farmers. So for each country in Europe, it's some of the most interesting regenerative farmers there that you can visit. So find your local regenerative farmer or other farmer, visit them, get to know them, listen to them, because it changes how you perceive food.
I would even want to add to that, go to climatefarmers.org. And because I was on there the other day and I found an amazing list. I found even a couple in Sweden I didn't know were regenerative farms. We're going to put all these links in the show notes. I think when you look at a system that the ones we're talking about here, it's always, of course, very relevant to look at the stories we tell as a collective, the myths we have in society that upholds the status quo. What is a myth you have seen prevalent, that you've been confronted with time and time again, that you see is very persistent?
Well, I think a key one is this idea we need to feed the world. That sort of defines our current conventional system. And it comes from that history of wanting to avoid famines. You could probably argue that it has been told by a number of corporations that benefited from that story, but this is in our education system. So we're still training the current generation of farmers that are now soon going to take over their parents' farms, because the average age of farmers in Europe currently is about 64. And that is a damaging story. What is true is we need to feed our community. And that's a fundamentally different story, because we need to feed the world means you need to grow wheat that looks like every other wheat, so it can go through the same processing and then it can be shipped to another place on the planet. Well, it turns out any day that product goes between harvest and consumption, it loses a ton of its nutritional value. So if we do that and we ship it halfway across the world, it's not really food anymore. What you want is you want to feed your local community, and we have farmers everywhere. So we need farmers to feed their local community, and we need that relationship. And we need that food-wise, but we also need that culturally. Because if we as a society, consumers, we call ourselves consumers, lose the connection, we have a huge problem as a society, because we take stupid decisions. We lose our way of how natural resources actually work, and then we end up with policies that we support as consumers that are actually really problematic. So the connection between the farm and society needs to be increased. Another one, it's quite connected, is a myth that is not only in agriculture, I see that everywhere, is the myth of productivity versus sustainability. It's extremely ingrained. When I go to the European Commission in Brussels and I talk about how regenerative agriculture can increase carbon, biodiversity, water, I immediately get pushback about food security. Yeah, but what about productivity? I never talked about productivity. I've said it can increase carbon sequestration, it can increase biodiversity, water infiltration. And so it's very difficult for policymakers to make different policies if the moment that you think you're going to get nature restoration, you're going to lose productivity. And we just saw that, by the way, with a law called Nature Restoration Law that had huge pushback because it was supposedly going to destroy productivity of agriculture. And there was no reason to assume that. By the way, this was the People's Party in the EU, extremely problematic when it comes to agriculture, side note. And on the other hand, we have that in pretty much everything, right? In businesses, we're talking about work-life balance, as if there was, a seesaw, where if you have more work, you have less life, and if you have more life, you have less work. This is an idea we need to get rid of, because it turns out that if we have more life, regenerative agriculture, if we have more life in the system, we have incredible productivity. So there's something wrong with that story. And we need to get rid of it, because it means that we lose either one of the things we really care about. We do want productivity. If I run an organization, I want it to be productive, but I want people to be healthy. And if this is a conflict, then I have to put two things in conflict with each other that I really don't want to have at conflict with each other, and they don't have to.
It sounds like on the one hand there's scarcity mindset, on the other hand there's abundance.
Yes, exactly.
Thinking that you can optimize for life instead of optimizing for yields because you're worried you're not going to be able to feed the growing population.
Okay.
Let's jump into a future where we have adopted that second mindset. We're optimizing for life. We're in a reality where regenerative agriculture is the norm. The fight is over, the battle is won. Transport us to that reality.
For me, this is the motivation of why I do this work. I really care about agriculture, I really care about nature, but the key thing for me is that we, in our current society, do not have a hopeful narrative. Narratives we're working with is like, okay, best case scenario, we do less harm. Not really motivating, right? And then we have a regenerative narrative, and I think this is why this is so attractive for so many people, where we say, let's optimize for life, and as a side effect of this, we're going to have great productivity. But we're optimizing for life, we're optimizing for diversity, quality, and quantity of life. I think is an extremely motivating narrative, and I think it can be modeled in an agri-food system, it can be modeled in agriculture. From agriculture, we need it to be in the agri-food system, otherwise agriculture can't work. And when we have it in agri-food system, I think it can move into society, right? Regenerative economics, regenerative education, regenerative leadership, whatever else, right? This is the hopeful future that I see, and that is extremely motivating for me. What do we do? There's a fundamental paradigmatic shift that happens. Carol Sanford speaks about this if anyone wants to read further. Essentially, she describes 4 paradigms. The paradigm of extraction, where I'm trying to get as much as possible out of the system in front of me. We've been in that paradigm for a long time. There's a paradigm of what she calls a rest disorder, which is sort of reducing the harm, right? Sort of sustainability. We try to do less damage. We're still sort of extracting, but let's try and do it not as badly. We have another paradigm, which is to do good. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to give back more than I take, which many people confuse with regenerative. It's not. There's a fourth one, which would be the regenerative one, and it's about developing capacity. And this is where we're focusing on life. There's a fundamental difference between doing good and developing capacity. If I imagine that I'm trying to do something good for you, I define what good is, and I'm doing it to you. So it's like, if I give you a present that I think is so cool, versus if I think about what would be super meaningful for Lisa, and how can I give that to her. There's a difference. Development cooperation is another example of this, where we are trying to do good, or are we trying to help people to do what they want to do. So the way we behave is fundamental, and it's happening in so many areas already. So this is also very hopeful. Like, this is not something that is way out on the horizon. This is already very normal. When you raise your child, do you look at what you think is good for them? Or do you ask them what do they want to do and what is important for them? Tiny difference, but really meaningful. When we're talking about policies for farmers, are we saying, oh, we want to do good for farmers, or are we asking them what would be good for them? Fundamental difference. Instead of saying as efficient as possible, you would be like, okay, well, how do we support farmers to produce for the long term? And we ask them about this, right? So a fundamental difference is that in such a system, agriculturally, but economically, business-wise, in every way, we would have a system where I look out for myself by asking others how I can increase their life quality, quantity, and diversity. Nonviolent communication is a great example for this. There's a lot of education that already works exactly like that. There are a lot of new work business practices that are exactly like that. So in a lot of ways, we are doing this. We don't call it by the term regenerative, but we are already in a lot of cases asking what would help you increase your life, improve your life, that would then have a repercussion on me.
And it sounds almost a little bit like we've learned how to step out of the way, just kind of allow things to run their course. We maybe as humans don't necessarily deeply trust that there is a bigger sort of organizing principle in nature that kind of knows what it's doing, and when it's allowed to run its course, it actually optimizes beautifully on its own. I studied Chinese and I lived for a little while in China, and nature in Chinese is called daziran, which translates into the big thing that happens by itself.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I always believe the language we use shapes our worldview and it shapes our actions in the world.
Interesting.
So I'm kind of imagining also this being a future where we have language that speaks to our integral connection and relationship with nature.
Interesting. I love this. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you see in such a reality? How would we get our food?
Yeah, so I'm going to paint the romantic picture and connect it with the current reality. The food is produced as locally as possible. That doesn't mean only, right? As I said, I don't think that transport is a problem, but we will have devices. Those devices already exist. It's basically like a little laser pointer that you hold against your food, and it can tell you the nutrient integrity or nutrient density of your food. And so we will know that this tomato versus that tomato makes more sense to buy, and that will automatically optimize for food that has been picked more shortly before you buy it, and it will optimize for healthy soils, because the micronutrients, so we get the carbohydrates, proteins, fats into our food no matter the soil, but the micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, etc., they only get into our food through healthy soils and mycelial connections, so the fungi in the soil. So if you have that device, you are immediately going to optimize for healthy and local food. That is one. You're going to have a better relationship with your farmers. Sounds romantic, but there is a connection with it, which is multinational supply chains are going to break down. Geopolitically, we're seeing it currently. Climatically, we're going to see it. If your multinational complex supply chains are not functional anymore, you're going to optimize for local ones. We've seen that in COVID, for example. So we're going to need a closer relationship to our farmers. We're going to need more farmers. We're going to need more of us going into farming. Of course, we already know that it would be possible for more of us living in the countryside farming, right? Right now we have a huge run of investment funds buying agricultural land, even in the name of regeneration. But that, of course, prevents individual people to buy land and produce food, right? Because it becomes more expensive. We will need to have more people on the land. Currently, again, the average age of farmers is 64, which means there's very few young people in farming. We will need that in order to what in Europe is increasingly called strategic autonomy. So we want to be independent from nations that are not maybe friendly to us, which is why we need food security, which is why we need young people. So we are going to learn probably soon that we need to invest in agriculture becoming more attractive and more people going to the land. We are going to increasingly understand the systemic nature of us and of our health. Sorry, complex term. We believe health, similar as with agriculture, our idea of health is mechanistic. We are basically a machine. You need to feed it the right ingredients, you need to feed it the right fuel, and then sort of the machine runs. And we're increasingly understanding that this is not how this works. And we know by now that a huge percentage of our cells is not our own, does not have our DNA. We are an ecosystem of different beings, of fungi, of bacteria. Our gut plays a huge role in our health. We know that. We know that our gut plays a huge role in our mental health. So if you think that you decide what you want to eat, think again. It's your gut that is telling you that, and those are bacteria and fungi that live within you. And it is very hard to say they live within you because they actually are you. So we are going to understand that in order to be healthy, we need to maintain a complexity of life. So when I said before, the diversity, quality, and quantity of life, I really mean the quantity of life, because you have a lot of life within you. We're going to look at how do I feed that complexity, because we also know by now that this microbiome feeds off diverse food. Not the right food, it's diverse food. And so you start looking at how can I feed myself more diversely, and so that already changes a lot. So I believe due to increased understanding of the reality of life, which is complex and diverse and interconnected, we're going to start taking different decisions on how we act. And weirdly, the current adverse dynamics, geopolitical and climatically, that can be very depressing, are pushing us in that direction. So I find myself in a very strange situation where whenever something very weird or even bad happens in the world, I often think about it, I'm like, interesting. This will actually speed up the transition that we're talking about. So it's strangely optimistic.
In this regenerative reality, what is next after that? What new opportunities have arisen?
Once we realize that we get much higher agricultural productivity, much less drought, much less floods that then flood our cities or don't flood our cities anymore, we have intense biological complexity and diversity on the field. So the more biological diversity we have on the field, the more food we're going to produce, the less inputs we're going to need, the more water infiltration we're going to have, the less flooding we're going to have, the more biodiversity we're going to have. When that really sinks in, and it will need to sink in because we need to become independent from actors that provide us with fossil inputs that we currently need for our current system. Once that really sinks in, it will make a change in how we treat other biological systems, children, how we treat organizations, how we treat states, right? We're currently approaching this from an industrial, monocultural, mechanistic point of view. And rather than saying, I'm going to take that bare soil and I'm going to put the nutrients in there so it can grow what I want it to grow, and now apply that to children, I'm going to take that blank canvas and I'm going to feed it the things that I want it to feed so it can output what I want it to output. And instead you say, how can I feed this biological system in the way that it needs to be fed, that it wants to be fed, so it can develop in its full health and it can create all that incredible output in every way. We are going to see a whole different kind of education system. We're going to see different ways and how we treat organizations, how we treat employees, how we treat even our notion of state, which is still, even though we know that democracy is the power of the many, we still treat it as if it was a top-down logic, right? And this paradigmatic shift is going to change everything. So this is why I always insist that we are not talking about more regenerative agriculture, because more regenerative agriculture within the same paradigm and the same extractive system is not going to make that happen. But the work on the regenerative agri-food system that really represents a paradigmatic shift can actually have an influence on the rest of society. And I think the interesting thing is that this will not happen about the word regenerative. The larger paradigmatic shifts happen under the surface, very, very slowly, and then very, very quickly. So it takes a long time for society to sort of work with a new insight. We are going to, for a long time, call this organic, and then we're going to call it agroecological, then we're going to call it regenerative, then we're going to call it 15 other things. And at a certain point, we're going to understand that this is how systems work, including all of our systems. And that is going to lead to a wave of innovations and a wave of changes in how we approach things, which is every time that something like this happens. The changes in physics, right, when we went from a mechanistic to a quantum physics, it suddenly inspired new thinking in a lot of different areas. I'm really curious when it happens, though. And when it happens, it's going to happen very quickly. And we're going to think it's normal, which is also going to be really interesting. We're not going to look at it as this is the regenerative revolution, because if we identify it as something else, it hasn't really sunk in yet. Like, it happens when it's just, yeah, of course, do it.
Common sense.
Exactly.
Ivo, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming to talk with me. I have gotten a lot more optimistic about all of this. Where can people go to follow you? I follow you on LinkedIn. How do people find you on LinkedIn?
Yes, people can follow me on LinkedIn, Ivo Degn. This is where I publish and try and keep the conversation going. If you're working actively in the agri-food system, we'd love to involve you. I would very much recommend people to follow the top 50 farmers if you're generally interested in regenerative agriculture. There are wonderful documentaries by the NGO Kiss the Ground, the first movie Kiss the Ground and Common Ground. There's a third one coming out soon. There are a number of other great documentaries. If you want to know more, I would recommend looking at the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, which is the largest network of pioneering farmers in Europe. And generally looking out for your local regenerative producer, even more than connecting to myself, because it's a movement that is very diverse and very, very grassroots. So I can very much recommend that.
Great. We'll put all that in the show notes for those of you who are interested. Thank you again.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Adjacent Possible. And a big thank you to Ivo for sharing his work and vision of a regenerative future. If today's conversation resonated with you, remember that you have an active part to play. Ivo's actionable directions are a great place to start. And if you want to support this podcast, why not share this with a person in your life you believe would enjoy it? That way we have more people joining the conversation and mapping the adjacent possible together. I'll be dropping an immersive story inspired by this conversation with Ivo, which imagines what living this regenerative reality might feel like. I invite you to step into this future and experience it from the inside out. Thank you for staying until the very end. Until next time, stay curious, connected, and committed to creating the adjacent possible.